Okay, Danielle, I've changed hosting permissions. So you're now the host, as and when any other attendees come through. If you could just take note if there's any requirement to permit access for them to partake in the seminar, in the
Okay,
webinar, sorry.
will do.
Great. Thank everybody else for attending the first of a 9-part series regarding the topic of Th2 immunological dominant solutions. It's a topic that's really close to heart, as I have noticed an exponential increase in this particular immunological phenotype over the last 7 years. And I myself, in 2018, succumbed to the effects of Th2 dominance 2, which instigated a autoimmune-like condition, which was erroneously initially diagnosed as autoimmunity, but evidently I later found and discovered that it wasn't autoimmunity, but rather innate immune dysregulative autoinflammatory states. So, at the time at which this had unfolded in my own health, I was a highly competitive athlete, living a very healthy lifestyle. And the reason why I highlight that is that it can impact anybody of any background. So Th2 immunological dominance really is a modern day variable of consideration that if we are able to identify multiple variables that I'm just going to pull up the first of our 9-part series PowerPoint presentation. And just to go back into what I was mentioning before, Th2 dominance is really a modern day dilemma that we find that many of us find ourselves to eventually exhibit. And the reason why I say that is, due to the advent, which is a welcomed introduction into global health of variables such as antibiotics, other forms of curative means of medicine, especially in the last century, these variables definitely contributed to an increase of global populace. But with that, there's also subsequently a cost that came about through the perpetual and habitual use of antibiotics. One can remember when I was a child growing up, it wasn't uncommon for doctors to readily prescribe antibiotics throughout the flu season. I think that if we look into the last century, the medical fraternity was most certainly overly zealous in their prescription of antibiotics. And this is just one of many variables that we are now contending with in our modern day time. Other variables include the increase technological evolution of cellular technologies, as an example, and the impact that non-native electromagnetic frequencies actually have on our bodies as well, which I'm going to get into more detailed throughout this webinar series. However, to start, we're going to go into some foundative principles of the immune system before we get into the nitty-gritty of Th2 immunological dominance and what that actually really means. And after which, I'm going to afford certain considerations that one could put into effect or at least consult with one's medical professional, whether it be your GP, a nurse practitioner, or otherwise. Or if you don't have one, they can always reach out to us and we can see what we can do via consultation to try and get your health back into working order. But you will, by the end of this webinar series, be empowered with the understanding of what certain molecules can do in order to rectify an imbalanced immunological state of reactivity, affording the opportunity to put the immune system back into a place of responsivity. So with that being said, I am going to shortly start our first PowerPoint presentation, which will equip you all again with the foundative knowledge involved in the understanding what the immune system actually is and what it's meant to do, and being able to highlight and grasp why it isn't doing what it ought to be doing, and through that being able to reverse engineer one's health back to a place of responsivity. Okay, guys. So getting straight into the immune system. So I like this to be an interactive process. And before I get into the intricacies of the immune system, may I ask each of you, or those of you who are inclined to want to contribute an answer, what it is that you currently understand about the immune system, and specifically if you have any further comprehensive understanding into what Th2 dominance actually is. Danielle, would you like to break the ice for everybody?
Sure, it might not be as intricate as your explanation, but from what I understand, it's essentially the way in which the body's T helper cells modulate the immune response, and it's more active than Th1 response. So essentially, I think Th2 responds more accurately on like parasites and allergens and things like that, and antibody generation.
Yeah, that's very it's humoral. I guess what it is that you were alluding to, Danielle, is humoral responses, and that's 100% accurate. Yeah, so Th2 responses are more focused on the extracellular activity or pathogenic activity in the extracellular space. So that's great. Thank you very much, Danielle. Amanda? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to get started with the presentation in and of itself. So Th2 dominant solutions. So before we can understand how to resolve when the immune system is overly active in an aspect of its response, we need to firstly be able to conceptualize what the immune system is going to do in its entirety, which brings us to by the end of this entire webinar series, you ought to be able to understand why the immune system is a tissue integrity and danger response network, not just an antimicrobial weapon. And this is really important because either a lack or an excess of immunological activity can lead to variables such as increase of fibrotic tissue accumulation in the body, which not only impacts connective tissue flexibility or fascial viability, but it also can have its impact on increasing the concentration of pro-inflammatory cytokine, in addition to also dysregulating the endocrine system. And the second point that I'd like everybody to be able to have a full understanding by the end of this webinar series is how the innate immunity instructs the adaptive immunity through cytokines and antigen presentation. It's really a cause and effect series and a complement that happens in order for the body to deal with a threat effectively. And the third point that I'm hoping that you'll all be able to understand by the end of this webinar series is how naive T cells differentiate into Th1, Th2, Th17, or T regulatory phenotypes. And lastly, why Th2 responses are physiologically useful but maladaptive when chronic or poorly regulated. Now, before I get started to the next slide, I just want to emphasize that the term Th2 dominance may suggest that other forms of T helper response or T helper cell responses are somewhat suppressed or subdued, and that's not necessarily the case. You see, essentially, you can have an increase of Th1 activity, which may afford an increase of apoptosis, the rapid breakdown of cells, to the point where tissue might become necrotic, in a situation whereby Th2 dominant histamine expression is also present. So when it is that we refer to Th2 dominance, we actually specifically are considering what reaction we ought to see in how the body releases histamine. And when it is that we don't see that response take effect and becomes more of a reactive outcome, leading to pathology or poor metabolic outcome, this is when we have the association of understanding that this is what is coined as Th2 immunological dominance. So undoubtedly, one could have an increase of Th17 activity in a Th2 phenotype, as an example, which is quite common in Th17 responses being related to an excess of neutrophil activity, within which one of the slides I will go into greater detail what that means from a perspective of creating an increase of pain, an increase of fibromyalgia-like symptomology as well. Okay, so essentially, the immune system maintains body integrity. The immune system control how it is that they detect, survey, interpret what's going on within the body, whether or not it's a threat or whether or not it might just be cellular debris. How it is that they can encourage the process of recovery or preserve tolerance to the environment, or potentially when there is misperception on what is going on with the environment, create a reaction to warrant defending the body from certain contaminants such as poisons or other forms of toxins. So essentially, danger sensing is when the immune activation is triggered by microbial signals and by alarm signals from injured or stressed tissues. So there is it's called PAMPs as well as DAMPs. How these acronyms are defined, PAMP stands for pathogen associated molecular pattern. And as one may assume, that has to do with the actual signals that are found either through a protein that's specific to a pathogen or even a carbohydrate chain that might be foreign to what the human body is natively aware or to come into its ecology or its environment. So when we have PAMPs, this is again an association to proteins or carbohydrate fragments that are seemingly dangerous to the body. The other variable are DAMPs, and these are damage associated molecular patterns. And these particular metabolites essentially are released as and when we have, as per example, an increase of lipid peroxidation, which may be disrupting mitochondrial membrane stability, leading to an increased release of cardiolipin as one of many an example. So, depending upon what it is that's going on within the body, whether or not there is an excess of pathogenic activity, or whether or not there is an excess of oxidative stress, inflammatory burden, the body can actually pick up these signals in both instances as a danger signal. And the more readily these danger signals are present in the body, the more acutely responsive to the point where it becomes reactive the immune system becomes. You see, essentially, what we want the immune system to do is to be able to detect what's going on within ourselves and in the environment in which we live, but we want it to be able to detect it in a means that's constructive, not destructive. Yet, when in the lives that we lead in the modern day times, including variables of ongoing psychological stress, such as the exposure of blue lights and computer screen exposure, such as the impact of psychosocial variables in the modern day time, not just the apparent toxins from plastics or organophosphates or heavy metals, although those variables most certainly do lead into the increased potential of a reactive state. However, it's far more than just the apparent toxins. It's actually to do with how, from a psychosocial aspect, we evolve as a culture into technological advanced stages of humanity. And that really comes, there's a sense of responsibility that we need to afford and understand, not just that of the state of our minds, and obviously putting practices in place, whether that be meditation or whether that be community work, and means to ground oneself out of the rat race as per se, but not to disregard that, to take those variables and those activities into place. But over and above that, to also understand the impact that all this is having on our physiology and to put certain preventative measures in place, dependent upon the individual, of course, to be able to help withstand the impact of hormesis, which is a fancy word for stress, so that we can have positive adaptation, not maladaptation, specifically not maladaptation in the immune system. The second point there, the immune system is very important for surveillance. Leukocytes circulate through blood and lymph, monitoring tissues for infection, damage, and abnormal cells. So the most important word in that sentence is circulate. There was a very famous physician who was actually more of a philosopher during his time, which wasn't uncommon during the time when he was a physician for physicians to be philosophers. They were very much innovative, conceptualizing savants, geniuses of their time. And the particular physician that I'm referring to, his name is Paracelsus. And Paracelsus had many a famous quote, but the one that I always lean on the most, which I think is so relevant in our day and age, is that there's but one disease, and its name is congestion. And it really sums up the state that we find humanity to be in, stuck behind computer screens or behind cell phones in a highly sedentary state in comparison to our ancestors. Now, if we also compare ourselves to our ancestors, undoubtedly they were far more labor intensive. They had a lot more physiological stress in terms of moving the body. Yet, when it comes to neurological stress and psychological stress, I think very few would argue against the fact that we, in our day and age, are exposed to far more information on a daily basis than what our forefathers were. And this also has its impact on circulation, as in when systems aren't given the opportunity to switch off, they overheat. And when things start to overheat, circulation may initially speed up from the heat, but an excess of heat can actually cause congestion as well. And it really is about keeping the balance within our thermoregulation in this particular example in a place that can support our immunity away from the likelihood of Th2 immunological dominance. And the third point here is really important is about regulation. The same destructive tools that clear pathogens must be restrained to prevent chronic inflammation and autoimmunity. So essentially, we want reciprocity, and that's what this is really implying over here. We want the immune system to have an effective degree of reciprocity, a certain type of language in which it can understand different members of its society, the immunological societies, so that we can have a coordinated response rather than a maladaptive reactive outcome. So essentially, there are four major layers from a bird's eye perspective, from a high level perspective of immune protection. First, you have your barriers, endothelial linings, mucosal cells, the impact that endothelial cells, epithelial cells may have in absorption, but also protection, cell membranes in and of themselves. Then we have our innate immune cells, which originate from stem cells called myelinoid stem cells. And this is very important to take into account because it's the origin as in where immune cells come from that is a big determining factor in the versatility that that particular immune cell may have in our immunological defense or response. Inflammation, essentially, if we were to consider what the main function of the immune system is, it's regulating inflammation to the point where it can either encourage recovery or to the point where it can either encourage a defense against a foreign body or invading pathogen. To that point, inflammation is all good and well. However, if there's a lot of inflammation, but there's poor decoration, and what I mean by that is decorating the variables that ought not to be in the body, then inflammation really falls short of efficacy. And this is where we go into the fourth point, to eventually to the fifth outcome, and that's antigen presentation. And you have different antigen presenting cells. Some of them can be activated macrophage, others can be dendrocytes. But whatever the antigen presenting cells are, essentially what their job is to present an aspect of a foreign body for the other components of the immune system, like your cytotoxic cells from your T cells, or to propagate more of an antibody response from your B cells. And then that ties into the adaptive response, which is where our T and our B lymphocytes come into the equation in order to create specificity and target efficacy in removing what it is that the body ought not to be harboring. To that point, barriers reduce unnecessary immune activation, skin, mucus, acid, saliva, cilia, and epithelial integrity. Innate immunity is rapid and pattern-based. Phagocytes, natural killer cells, complement, and microbial substances. Adaptive immunity is slower but specific. B cells produce antibodies, T cells direct cellular immunity and regulation. And if we just go into this particular diagram over here, essentially this just sums it up quite intimately on the difference that protect the immune system from exposure to unwanted pathogens or pollutants, the different layers in the immune system itself, from leukocytes to granulocytes to lymphocytes to phagocytes, and what they all mean. Leukocytes is a global term for all our white blood cells. Granulocytes refer to cells that release histamine specifically. Lymphocytes are your T and your B cells. Again, B cells are important for what they call opsonization, which is a very fancy word which refers to just being able to create antibodies to decorate variables that need to be removed from the body. And then your T cells, you have three major classes of T cells: Treg cells, T helper cells, and cytotoxic lymphocytes. And their main role is actually to help remove what ought not to be there. And then your phagocytes, these are cells that actually consume. So a macrophage is the acronym of monocytes. It's actually a term which it translated from Latin into English means large eater. And essentially, if we think about that, the consumption that these cells have is actually to completely break down and remove toxic debris or pathogens, depending upon the type of pathogen in question and whether or not they have the capacity to phagocytize and remove them from the body. In certain instances of pathogenic variables, such as viruses that alter their genetic structure, RNA-based viruses, phagocytes aren't the most effective player in the immune system to rid the body of these unwanted insurgents. And in those instances, this is where our B cells and our T cells get involved into the equation in order to remove those variables from our bodies. And then you get the different types. You have five major classes of antibodies. IgM is the largest and your initial antibody response. IgE is more of your allergenic antibody response. IgA helps to remove parasitic larger variables that may be found in the gastrointestinal tract. And your IgG and your IgD levels, they also have more specificity to certain types of microorganism and infection rate. Types of immunity, again, just to sum up here. So, from a high level perspective, you have two major classes that are involved in the immune system. And those classes are the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. So, just as the name implies, the innate immune system is a more naturally state of the immune vigilance. So, it doesn't really alter its structure. Its main role is more so surveillance. It does clear up and inhibit the likelihood of certain common, well-known bacterial variables that our genome has had exposure to for millennia. So in those instances, when it is that we have had exposure to a certain antigen or mitogen complex, the innate immune players would be able to rid us of those particular variables, common bacteria, and so on. However, when it's more complex, and we say now we have cell wall deficient bacteria in the equation, such as Borrelia or Rickettsia, this is where we find it a bit more difficult for the innate immune system to be able to detect what is going on, and thus rid the body from those variables. And this is where the adaptive immune system comes in. So the innate immune system undoubtedly in these particular scenarios will be able to determine that there's an anomaly playing out in the body. And this is where it can send certain signals. One of the quickest ways in which to instigate a threat signal is actually the release of ATP from the mitochondria into the extracellular space. So when we lose ATP and it's released into the extracellular space, this is the most immediate catalyst to instigate inflammation and to warrant an increase of threat response from the immune system in and of itself, which actually ties into a lot of the work that we will be discussing in later segments that Professor Robert Navier spent most of his life putting together in a framework called the cell danger response. The adaptive immune system is highly reliant upon antigen-presenting cells and the efficacy of them being able to provide an understanding or at least an idea of what should or what isn't going or what should not be happening in the body.
I do have one question. It might be a tad bit off topic, but would you say that just relating to spike protein elevation, would you say that persistent exposure to spike protein derived from COVID times, for example, would alter macrophage function in a way that shifts immune signaling more towards a Th2 dominant state?
Undoubtedly, yes. There's been many a paper and research that have determined or found, albeit that most of the research is still in vitro. So there hasn't been as many, there've been more observational studies that can allude to in vivo outcome in this particular subject. But in the in vitro, they were able to determine that spike protein undoubtedly infiltrates monocytes, which are the precursor to macrophage release into tissues. And spike protein's infiltration of monocytes renders macrophage into a pro-inflammatory phenotype. Basically, the macrophage, given that they are the clearance factors of the body, essentially, that their job is not just to rid pathogens, but also cellular debris, as I mentioned to you before. So, given that consideration, when it is that macrophage are or macrophage programs are distorted toward a more pro-inflammatory expression, the cytokine release from those macrophages will actually aggravate polymorphonuclear leukocytes, which constitute your neutrophils, your eosinophils, your basophils, and your mast cells, to release histamine. So the macrophage in this particular scenario, it can't fully detect what is going wrong because it doesn't realize that it's actually being infiltrated by a foreign body such as spike protein. But it does know that something's happening that ought not to be happening. So it will cause an increased release of interleukin 6 amongst other forms of chemokines, such as CXCL, CL13, which can instigate CXCR5, which is also known as RANTES. And this is where Dr. Bruce Patterson has done extensive work in trying to repurpose a lot of the medication used for HIV from an antiretroviral perspective in supporting the recovery of the long haul COVID cohort. High quantity of spike protein load most certainly does distort the innate immune system. And in that distortion leads it to an increased likelihood of reactivity. And when the innate immune system is in a state of reactivity, it is more inclined to be in a state of hyper release of histamine. This is really important to take into consideration because histamine doesn't just cause congestion, as most people are probably aware or have the association with regards to using antihistamines, but it does a lot more than that. Histamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter in that it can actually cause a lot of sleep disturbances as well. Most notably, when people find themselves being able to fall asleep and then they're waking up frequently throughout the evening hours, this has been associated in Chinese medicine to a compromise in the liver meridian. And that's completely accurate in my experience. But it's not just that the liver automatically just gets congested because of environmental toxins. That could be a probability. However, in this particular scenario, when there is a hyper release of histamine, it also causes microvasculature fibrosis, which does lead the liver into a state of poor detoxification and poor lymphatic flow to that point as well. Yes, most certainly an increase of spike protein does lead to maladaptive macrophage response. And this is where we would see macrophage activation syndrome. And when one sees an increase of macrophage activity, it's not necessarily due to the efficacy of that activity, but rather the lack of efficiency. In other words, the body's trying to do something, but it's being stopped in its capacity to be able to effectively achieve the end result. Notably, in order for macrophage to be given better vision, if I can use that analogy, you need to have effective B and T lymphocyte activity. So you can already see the complex scenario that we found ourselves to be in, the predicament that we found ourselves to be in that in order for the adaptive TMB lymphocytes response to be effective to support macrophage clearance capacity, we need a healthy innate immune antigen presenting complex ability or scenario. Now, if our antigen presenting complexes, such as macrophage being one form of antigen presenting cell, is somewhat disarmed, this leads to a poor T and B specific lymphocyte response. And without these particular lymphocytes responding in a favorable manner, we cannot remove two types of sugars, one galactosidase, another one sialosidase. Essentially, these are two sugars that need to be removed in order for a protein to have the docking capacity for macrophage activation, and in that capacity to clear variables such as spike protein from the body. So Spike protein is most certainly a sinister variable that definitely leads to an ongoing Th2 type immunological reactive phenotypic response. Does that answer your question, Danielle?
Yes, most certainly. Thank you, Justin.
Okay. I think Amanda had left a question here, just in the Q&A sector. Apparently, Lyme co-infections behave like a spike protein. Is that true? Well, they are, when we think about limes, it's a spirochete, the formation of spirochete. And yes, the formation of spirochete is very similar to the formation of neutrophil extracellular traps, in that there's an accumulation of cytokine and other pro-inflammatory proteins such as beta-2 microglobulin that can accumulate in these particular spirochete bundles or neutrophil extracellular traps. So, in that regard, Lyme's co-infections most certainly can distort the immune system into a Th2 dominant state, but somewhat differently to how spike protein does so. From my understanding, there's no direct infiltration into these immune subsets, as in how spike protein operates. However, due to the cell wall deficient state, the immune system will try to compensate by the lack of detectability, and it does so by way of increasing or exacerbating, shall I say, the release of histamine from polymorphonuclear leukocytes. Interestingly, when there is such an infection such as Lyme's or its co-infections or rickettsia or any cell wall deficient variable COVID operative, other forms of COVID operatives also start to come out the woodwork, such as DNA-based viruses that most of us have had exposure to, but not many of us necessarily have active viral or don't necessarily have active, don't have a necessarily have an active virus state, such as Epstein-Barr, cyclomegalovirus, or herpes. So the majority of the adult population in the world probably has had some form of exposure at some point in the history of their lifetime. It's easily transferable from the saliva of a mother to a baby, as an example. So being as highly contagious as it is, these DNA-based viruses, they remain in a dormant state and they wait up until the point where we go into a state of immune compromise, which is often seen in states of immunological hyperreactivity. And it's to this point that I found quite interesting. Since COVID, there's been a sharp rise of Lyme disease prognoses. And there's also been more and more mention on different social platforms of Epstein-Barr reoccurrence or reemergence, shall I say. Alongside that, also the development of turbo cancers has come into effect. But all of this can really be associated back to this Th2 immunological dominant immunological state, which is basically a product of poor responsivity between immune complexes due to the immune system trying to eradicate a variable that it's lost the recognition of how to do. Does that answer your question there, Amanda? You can type if you like as well. I can see. Yes, thank you. Okay, great. Are there any other questions that anybody else would like to ask? I have given permission to all of you. Hi, Bernardo. Thanks for joining us as well. Feel free. Does anybody else have any other questions or contributions they'd like to add to this segment of the presentation? No. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so let's move on. So essentially, this is fundamental to understand that there's a cause and effect process that happens, all of which regulates inflammation. And one of the quickest ways in order to instigate aging is uncontrolled inflammation in the body. So by way and large, with the popular rise of anti-aging measures, one of the ways in which we can prevent the aging disease paradigm from coming into effect is by way of how to regulate our immune system away from a state of Th2 immunological dominance. And so no immunological dominance is something that we should warrant having in our existence, but rather immunological equilibrium to a point of responsivity. Moving on to the next slide over here, innate recognition tells the adaptive system what to become. Okay, so if you think about it, the innate immune system is kind of like the quarterback that throws a football to the guy who catches the football to make the touchdown. I'm really not a sports guy. And the guy who's making the touchdown is the adaptive immune component. So essentially, if it is that your quarterback is not being defended properly and has a lot of the defense from the other team coming on, stopping him from being able to throw the ball effectively, it's not going to land where it needs to, and there's going to be no touchdown being made. And utilizing this analogy, we can really see that there is a cause and effect that the innate immune players, which again consist of your macrophage, your neutrophils, your eosinophils, your basophils, your mast cells, as well as your natural killer cells. And I'm going to come to why the natural killer cells, out of all the innate immune players, is the most versatile and interesting variable within the innate immune system to contemplate and to look into means and how to improve the efficacy of its capacity to remove variables that ought not to be in the system in the first place. Before we can get into all the interesting variables of augmenting the immune system into a better state of vigilance, we first have to consider pattern recognition receptors. So essentially, pattern recognition receptors are receptors in which certain innate immune system players will trigger a sequence for adaptive outcomes. So as an example, a toll-like receptor, which is a form of pattern recognition receptor, 1, 2, 4, and 6, they all recognize bacterial lipids. Toll-like receptor 3, 7, and 8, they generally recognize RNA-based viruses like COVID. TLR9 recognizes both viral and bacterial DNA. TLR5 and TLR10 recognize bacterial or parasitic proteins. And you've got nucleotide oligomerization domains, as well as C-type lectin receptors and RIG1-like leptin receptors. And these are for the complement factors that basically punch holes in bacteria or other larger forms of microorganisms, and in doing so, cause their death to occur. With regards to the pattern-associated molecular patterns or the damage-associated molecular patterns, the activation of pattern recognition receptors is highly instigated by these metabolic variables, which could be microbial or endogenous stimuli by the results of activation of multiple signaling pathways, including the activation of nuclear factor kappa beta. When we see an elevated neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio on white blood cell differential, this is suggestive of the fact that there's an increased activity of nuclear factor kappa beta. Nuclear factor kappa beta is the primary initiative cytokine that triggers a cascade of cytokine effect throughout the innate component, which is warranted, again, if that effect is contained. However, the perpetual stimulation of these pattern recognition receptors by variables that have not been contained, such as cell wall deficient bacteria that just keep on proliferating due to the lack of the detection capacity of the innate immune system, this in itself can lead to a nuclear factor kappa beta expressive state, which causes an increase in the neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. So essentially, what it is that you guys need to take home from this, toll-like receptors, nucleotide oligomerization domain receptors, C-type lectin receptors, RIG1-like receptors, they all detect conserved microbial or damage-associated patterns. Nuclear factor kappa beta or mitogen activated protein kinase and interferon pathways shape cytokine output. Those cytokines bias the later T helper cell phenotype, whether it's Th1, Th2, or Th17. So depending upon what it is that's going on here and how well contained this particular activity results in being, we may either have healthy Th2 response, or we may have a reactive Th2 response that can result from such imbalanced activity. Antigen presentation, so the who sees the what rule, okay? So essentially, a major histocompatibility complex 1 versus major histocompatibility complex 2. The first complex detects what's going on inside the cell. It has a much shorter peptide chain in contrast to the latter major histocompatibility complex 2. Given that the major histocompatibility complex 1 detects what's going on inside cells, MHC2 its main role is to detect what's going on outside cells. And this is where Danielle alluded to in the beginning of the webinar, what it is that Th2 responses are responsible for. And that is pretty much to detect what's going on in the extracellular space. So again, the intracellular signal, extracellular antigen, from the major histocombatitive complex 1, you're going, if there are anomalies going on within the cell the body can detect, it's going to release a cytotoxic outcome. What that means is basically your cytotoxic cells will tell the cell that's being corrupt to commit suicide. And the purpose of that is so that it cannot continue to infect neighboring cells with the variable that has infiltrated its construct. Now, this would be highly useful in situations whereby spike protein has infiltrated certain immune complexes, and it's not only macrophages, but it's also CD4 type T lymphocytes, which have a lot to do with your helper cells as well, in which spike protein has infiltrated. So when it is that we have healthy MHC1 detectability, we can stop those cells that have been infected by spike protein, of which spike protein basically hijacks the ribosomal machinery of these cells to cause those cells to produce more and more spike protein. So it's not just about the spike protein that we're exposed to from a single instance of COVID or from a vaccine, but rather the impact that that particular protein code can influence our immune systems to continue to replicate and produce more of the spike protein. So essentially, the outcome of this could be compounded perpetual infection to the point where it doesn't get resolved. And when the immune system cannot resolve a threat, it leads itself into a state of reactivity. Now, reactive states will most certainly lead to increased histamine release because the body, again, is trying to rid a variable that can't fully recognize as to how to pinpoint where this insurgence is coming from. So it basically creates a proliferative response, an exacerbated amount of inflammation in the attempt to try and create neutrality, which unfortunately, unless there's modulation to this point, can lead to pathology like lupus being probably the more well-known of Th2 dominant type autoimmune conditions. It's not generally the order of precedence or the sequence to the eventual development of autoimmunity is whereby the immune system, the innate immune system, first starts in a state of a dysregulated autoinflammatory response. So when autoinflammatory response is perpetuated for prolonged periods of time, this can eventually lead into the adaptive immune system becoming reactive to our own cells, which is essentially autoimmunity. So the point I'm trying to make here is one begets the other. If it is that we cannot create a pattern interrupt into an autoinflammatory response from the innate immune system, there's a high likelihood that actual autoimmunity can manifest from that dysregulated autoinflammatory state. MHC2, again, measures the primary role is to detect what's going on outside of the cell. Now, I really want you to consider what that actually means. If there is a masking agent, there's a certain variable, say, for example, Epstein-Barr. Epstein-Barr has the capacity to hijack ribosomal machinery in cells, and in doing so, create a protein that looks very similarly to a cytokine called interleukin 10. Now, interleukin 10 tells the body that it calms the body's response down, and it would more so heighten, if there's still a threat state, the extracellular detection from coming in or to come into effect. So essentially, it will propagate or potentiate extracellular surveillance, which means an increase of histamine, albeit that the virus is actually inside the cell. So it's in these certain instances or examples whereby you can have covert operatives distorting how the immune system is able to detect what's going on. And the same thing for Borrelia as well, also has a very similar mechanism as to how it can distort intracellular detection and heighten or propagate polymorphonuclear leukocyte expression. If it is that the body perceives that there's nothing going on inside cells, it's going to heighten the ability to determine what's going on outside cells, which is whereby there's an excess release of histamine that comes into effect. To that point, you got certain CD4 helper T cells that come into the equation here, Th2, Th17, and these direct the outcome of what it is that's going on from your extracellular antigen presentation. Th2 dominance is mainly a CD4 helper cell polarization problem. It affects natural killer cells, cytotoxic lymphocytes, B cells, mast cells, and endocrine mitochondrial networks downstream. So moving on to the next slide here. Naive T cell differentiation, the central map. A single naive T cell can become very different immune programs depending on the cytokine concentration. So essentially, depending upon what concentration of cytokine we have, and this is where Patterson's 14-point cytokine map really does provide us, or at least alludes to the probability of activity instigating a more dominant arm of the immune system's activity. When it comes to Th1, cellular pathogenic activity, we've got interferon gamma, interleukin 2. These are the more predominant ones. And these will heighten the Th1 response to look inside cells. Another one's interleukin 12. This also is a very big instigator for Th1 activation and reduction of Th2 activation, interleukin 12. In contrast, when there's an increase in interleukin 4, interleukin 5, interleukin 13, this is more about humoral activity. Basically, what that means is detection outside of the cellular space. Th17, interleukin 17, interleukin 21, interleukin 22. And this is basically when there's a proliferative neutrophil activity that goes on. Now, neutrophils, as in how they neutralize a threat, is by way in the release of hydrogen peroxide. So when it is that you find somebody that has a lot of gray hair or they're more genetically susceptible to it, there are actually certain genome that creates a heightened probability of certain autoimmune, autoinflammatory types. These are HLA, human leukocyte antigen genomes. You get HLA-A to C, which is mostly the intracellular component, and HLA-D, which is more the extracellular component. But regardless of the HLA, some of us are more susceptible to an increase or exacerbated activity of neutrophil activity. And when this happens is you basically have a hyper-responsive hydrogen peroxide effect, which depletes variables such as glutathione, also impacting methylation rates, shortening telomeres, and so on. Not to mention the impact that it can have in the increased probability of arthritic tendencies, rheumatic arthritic tendencies, or dermal issues as well that can arise from an increase of Th17 response. And then our T regulatory cells, they kind of control the degree and the magnitude of our response or the immune system's response, or in an ideal scenario, reduce the reactivity that the immune system has in unchecked scenario. Cytokines associated Tregs are transforming growth factor beta, interleukin 10, and all of these suppress and create greater degrees of tolerance to what it is that's going on within the internal environment or the external variables contributing toward that. So just to sum up over here, interferon gamma, interleukin 12, these are all big instigators for Th1 cell-mediated immunity. Interleukin 4, as well as interleukin 5, interleukin 13. But interleukin 4 is the initial catalyst that will drive an increase of Th2 response. And when there's a heightened Th2 response, you're going to have interleukin 5 and 13 being propagated. Now, as you can see, humoral activity has a lot to do with the antibody response. And when we do have a dysregulated, hyperproliferated Th2 response, this can distort B cell efficacy. It can actually distort the B cell receptor's capacity to be able to effectively alter the antibody type in order to improve upon opsonization to detect microbial variables. So essentially, the greater the distortion of Th2 response, the less effective antibodies are in being able to decorate variables in the body that ought to be removed. And then when we go into Th17, Th17 cells are often closely associated to an increased activity from histamine from Th2 cells. at which point that proliferated response can also result in things such as metabolic resistance, an increase of fat accumulation, which or a fat loss resistance issues can come into effect. And one of the reasons, which I will go into greater detail about in other upcoming lectures, is the way in which histamine can cause microvasculature fibrosis. And what that eventually does, it results in poor delivery of certain catalysts, such as triiodothyronine, also known as T3, to instigate a certain mitochondrial response. So when it is that the body cannot receive a metabolic message, it goes into a state of protection, right? And this is where we find that we have fat cells that become hyperandrogenized, or we find that insulin sensitivity is somewhat suppressed. And in these particular scenarios, such as when there's an excess of visceral fat, the body is more prone to release variable cytokines such as interleukin 6 due to the association that an increase of visceral fat has in a decrease of adiponectin availability. So in those scenarios, an increase of interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and interleukin 23 can instigate the increase of Th17 helper response, which basically creates a proliferative outcome to more neutrophil activity, leading into that increased pain phenotype, as well as other forms of eczema and dermal issues as well. Okay. That's the end of the first segment. It's a bit more of a shorter initial segment. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions that anybody may have for today's segment. All right. Danielle, are you still there?
Indeed, I am.
Great. Any questions on your part, Danielle? Are you happy with the introduction? We are going to go into more nitty-gritty and interesting variables as the webinar series gets into the depths. But just as an introduction, you'll find that you have a better grasp on the different aspects that the immune system has in response to environmental variables. And I'm referring to the innate immune system and the adaptive immune system. Does everybody understand from a high level what these different aspects of immunity are responsible for and why they have importance in the subject of Th2 immunological dominance?
I think for me, it was quite interesting going into all of the different variables associated. I think it's safe to assume that the interconnected nature of all of these variables is incredibly interesting. And I'm really looking forward to diving in a little bit deeper in the upcoming webinars. But I found it to be incredibly insightful, and I'm quite excited for what's ahead. I suppose not really too much to add from my side, but from more of a philosophical standpoint, what is it to you, or what made you focus heavily on Th2 dominance for this webinar from a personal perspective, I suppose?
It's because it's become such a widespread condition, really. And a lot of people aren't even aware of its particular expression that's going on in global health. You know, people have been given prognoses of pathology. You know, every itis or prefix or suffix in medicine has been thrown at people, and they've been put into this reductive box and told that they have an autoimmune condition, or that they have hypothyroidism, or that they have IBD or IBS. I have as yet to see any professional body really provide the public with an understanding as to why these pathologies are on the rise, why they're becoming more and more prevalent, and what are the underlying mechanisms that have instigated the increased rise of even something as innocent as rhinitis to something more complex like lupus. Modern medicine has progressed in leaps and bounds over the years. And we still find that statistically there's a rise in cancer, there's a rise in autoimmunity. And I wholly believe that a big contribution as in why terror cancers are coming into effect, or why autoimmunity is becoming more and more prevalent, is because we have lost the effective ability to be responsive and symbiotic with the environments that we have around us. And we've led ourselves into a place where we become more and more reactive to what is going on around us, as well as what's going on within ourselves. So my intention behind writing Responsive Living, as well as providing this particular seminar for people to review, was to increase awareness of what the immune system is all about, firstly. But then further to that point, once you understand the cause and effect that ought to happen, you realize what's not happening. And you'll also be given insight into the variables that are distorting an immune system from not doing what it was intended to do. And with that knowledge, I believe that individuals have then got the capacity to not just take a pill for an ill, but to be able to reverse engineer from a habitual perspective of what it is that they do within their lifestyles, to altering their environment and potentially altering the way in how it is that they think of themselves or the world, the psychosomatic aspect to the physiological expression, they're all one and the same. And when it is by means of modern day introjection, such as the perpetual, habitual exposure to social media and technological frameworks, this undoubtedly does have its impact on our bodies, despite what people may think. Yes, we can have protective measures like blue light blocking glasses in place, and I recommend them for anybody that does spend quite a few hours behind the PC. But even with these protective measures in place, that does weigh a toll on the body, and we need to think holistically. And that word, I think it's been thrown around so often in the past that it's lost the weight of what it actually means. And holistically really means thinking of whatever is going on in this wall behind me. This is holistic physiological thinking. And holistically is thinking of all the variables that coincide in the activity of life. That's holistic thinking, from my opinion, in any case. So not to complicate, because for the layman that's maybe not invested into the education of medicine or physiology, you need not understand the complexity of all this. But what I hope to gift the public from this webinar series is just enough of a foundative understanding to recognize, oh, I was actually given a lot, this is a rudimentary example. I was given a lot of antibiotics growing up as a kid, but yet, that antibiotic use didn't always accompany a target effective probiotic. So perhaps, there's some reverse engineering that ought to be considered in that variable. Or another variable, whether or not a baby was breastfed, or whether that can also have an impact on the development of the microbiome, to the point which it can alter the immune state and make one more vulnerable. There have been multiple studies that have actually documented the impact that bottle-fed babies, that bottle feeding has on both men and women, but specifically in the female cohort, increases the likelihood of polycystic ovary syndrome, increases the likelihood of insulin resistance, obesity, and endometriosis, because Th2 dominance, or an increase of histamine, most certainly doesn't only impact certain pathology, from immunological pathology, but can also distort endocrine efficiency, particularly in the female's body, which is so much more complex from an endocrine perspective if in comparison to a male's. So I'm hoping that what one can gain from this is the understanding of being able to not only restore harmony in the immune system, but restore harmony in the entirety of the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system, a trifecta of health, essentially. Does that answer your question, Danielle?
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Justin.
You're welcome. Okay. Great. Well, everybody, thank you very much for your attendance today. We will be launching the next segment of the webinar series in a month's time. We'll be doing one a month for another 8 months to go. I do, just for those of you who may be interested, I have put together a webinar, a 3-part webinar series. It's mostly directed for practitioners, and it is about the bioidentical hormones from a preventative medicine perspective, as in how to leverage the use of bioidentical hormones to offset the likelihood of disease, and what particular parameters one ought to consider in monitoring their use over and above the conventional hormonal marker milieu that is often associated for diagnostic purposes. All right, guys, thank you so much for your attendance, and I look forward to catching up in a month from now. If there are any other questions you have after the segment, please feel free to email us at info@autonomicwellness.com, and I look forward to seeing you all in a month's time. Take good care. Bye now.
Thank you, Justin.